Sacajawea, a journey through history. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Sacajawea, a woman whose name has become synonymous with courage, resilience, and the pioneering spirit of early America. Her story is one that transcends the boundaries of time, connecting us to an era when the vast western territories of North America remained largely unexplored by European Americans, when indigenous peoples still maintained their traditional ways of life across sweeping prairies and towering mountain ranges, and when a young Shoshone woman would find herself at the center of one of history's most celebrated expeditions of discovery. As we settle in this evening, let us journey together through the remarkable life of Sacajawea, whose existence spanned merely 2.5 decades yet left an indelible mark on the history of a growing nation. Her story is not simply one of adventure and exploration, though these elements certainly define much of what we know about her. Rather, it is a deeply human tale of survival, adaptation, loss, and perseverance that speaks to the universal experiences that connect all people across cultures and centuries. The world before Sacajawea. To truly understand Sacagawea's life, we must first understand the world into which she was born. The year 1788 marked a time of tremendous transformation across the North American continent. In the eastern regions, the newly formed United States of America was still finding its footing, having ratified its Constitution just 1 year earlier. George Washington would soon become the nation's first president, and the young republic consisted of merely 13 states clustered along the Atlantic seaboard. But westward, beyond the Mississippi River and stretching toward the distant Pacific Ocean, lay an immense territory that remained, from the perspective of European Americans, largely mysterious and unmapped. This was not, of course, an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. These lands had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years, peoples who had developed sophisticated cultures, intricate trade networks, and profound connections to the landscapes they inhabited. The Rocky Mountain region, where Sacajawea would spend her early childhood, was home to numerous Native American tribes, each with their own distinct languages, customs, and territories. The Shoshone people, into whose tribe Sacajawea was born, were one of several groups who called this challenging but beautiful landscape home. They were a people intimately connected to the rhythms of the seasons, following game animals through mountain valleys, gathering plants and roots, and maintaining a way of life that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. The Shoshone, also known as the Snake Indians by some neighboring tribes and early European explorers, occupied territories that stretched across what would later become parts of Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and Nevada. They were not a single unified tribe, but rather consisted of several bands, each adapting to the specific environments they inhabited. Some bands lived primarily in the mountains and valleys, hunting large game and gathering mountain plants. Others inhabited the high desert plains, where they developed expertise in hunting smaller game and gathering the diverse plant resources of the arid landscape. Life for the Shoshone in the late 18th century was both challenging and rewarding. The Rocky Mountain region offered abundant resources for those who knew how to find and use them, but it also demanded respect, skill, and constant vigilance. Winters could be brutally cold, with deep snows that made travel difficult and game scarce. Summers brought warmth and abundance, but also the need to prepare for the harsh months ahead. The Shoshone had developed over centuries a deep understanding of how to thrive in this environment. Knowledge passed down from generation to generation through stories, demonstrations, and direct experience. Birth and early childhood. Into this world, sometime around 1788, a baby girl was born. The exact date and location of her birth remain uncertain, lost to the passage of time and the absence of written records among her people. What we know is that she was born into a Lemhi Shoshone band, likely somewhere in the region that would later become Idaho, near the Salmon River area where her people traditionally gathered and hunted. The name we know her by today, Sacajawea, has itself been the subject of much historical debate and discussion. The meaning and even the spelling of her name have been interpreted in different ways by historians and linguists over the years. Some scholars argue that Sacajawea derives from the Hidatsa language, meaning bird woman, while others contend that the proper spelling should be Sacagawea from the Shoshone language, meaning boat launcher or boat pusher. Still others suggest alternative interpretations and spellings. For our purposes this evening, we will use the spelling Sacajawea, acknowledging that this remarkable woman's identity, like so many aspects of her life, carries layers of complexity and multiple perspectives. Her early childhood would have followed the patterns typical for Shoshone girls of her time. From her earliest days, she would have been surrounded by the warmth and care of her extended family, learning through observation and participation in daily life. Shoshone culture, like many indigenous cultures, emphasized the importance of community and the interconnectedness of all members of the band. Children were treasured, and their education was considered the responsibility of the entire community, not just their immediate parents. As a young girl, Sacajawea would have spent her days playing with other children, exploring the areas around her band's camps, and gradually beginning to learn the skills she would need as an adult woman in Shoshone society. She would have watched the women of her band as they gathered roots, particularly the nutritious camas bulbs that were a staple of the Shoshone diet. She would have observed them preparing animal hides, creating clothing and shelter materials, and cooking meals. She would have learned which plants were useful for food, which could be used for medicine, and which were dangerous. The oral traditions of her people would have filled her evenings, as elders shared stories that carried both entertainment and essential teachings about how to live properly, how to treat others, and how to understand the spiritual dimensions of the world around her. These stories connected her to her ancestors, explained the origins of natural features in the landscape, and provided moral guidance. They taught respect for the animals that gave their lives to feed the people, reverence for the plants that sustained them, and understanding of the delicate balance that must be maintained between humans and the natural world. She would have learned to ride horses, for by this time the Shoshone had incorporated horses into their culture, transforming their ability to hunt, travel, and engage in trade and warfare. Horses had arrived in the region through complex trade networks that ultimately traced back to the Spanish colonies to the south, and they had revolutionized life for many Native American peoples of the plains and mountains. For the Shoshone, horses were both practical tools and sources of wealth and prestige. The young Sacajawea would have experienced the seasonal movements of her band as they traveled to different locations throughout the year to take advantage of resources that became available in different seasons. In spring, they might move to areas where camas and other roots could be harvested. Summer would bring opportunities to hunt game that had grown fat on the season's abundance. Fall was a crucial time for final preparations before winter, gathering and preserving as much food as possible. Winter camps were typically established in locations that offered some protection from the harshest weather, where the band would rely on their stored provisions and whatever game could be hunted nearby. Her childhood would also have included the normal joys and sorrows of human life. She would have played games with other children, learned songs, experienced the excitement of successful hunts and the arrival of trading partners, and felt the sorrow when illness or accidents took members of the community. She would have begun to understand her place in the intricate web of relationships that defined Shoshone social life, learning the appropriate ways to interact with different relatives and community members. The raid that changed everything then, when Sacajawea was approximately 11 or 12 years old, her childhood came to an abrupt and traumatic end. The exact year remains uncertain, but it was likely around 1800 when a raiding party from the Hidatsa tribe, who lived much farther to the east in what would later become North Dakota, attacked her band's camp. Intertribal raiding was not uncommon during this period. Different tribes competed for territory, resources, and prestige, and raiding parties might travel great distances to strike at enemy camps. The objectives of such raids varied. Sometimes they sought to steal horses, which were valuable property. Sometimes they aimed to capture people, particularly women and children who could be adopted into the raiding tribe or traded. Sometimes they were acts of revenge for previous attacks. On this particular day, the Shoshone camp was attacked near the Three Forks area in what is now Montana, a significant location where three rivers converge to form the Missouri River. The attack came suddenly, giving the Shoshone little time to mount an effective defense. In the chaos and violence of the raid, several Shoshone were killed, including some of Sacagawea's family members and friends. Others managed to escape, fleeing into the surrounding landscape. But Sacajawea was not among those who escaped. She was captured by the Hidatsa raiders, along with several other Shoshone, including another young girl who would later become known as Otter Woman. In an instant, everything she had known was torn away. Her family, her community, her home, her entire way of life, all were suddenly gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of being a captive of people whose language she did not speak and whose intentions toward her were unclear. The journey from the mountains of Shoshone territory to the Hidatsa villages along the Missouri River would have taken weeks, perhaps months. During this time, Sacajawea and the other captives would have been forced to travel on foot or horseback across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory. They would have experienced fear, grief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what fate awaited them. The loss of her previous life must have been devastating for the young girl. Everything familiar was behind her, and ahead lay only the unknown. Life among the Hidatsa. The Hidatsa villages along the Knife River in present-day North Dakota represented a world very different from the one Sacajawea had known among the Shoshone. The Hidatsa were semi-sedentary agricultural people who lived in large, dome-shaped earth lodges clustered in permanent villages. Unlike the more nomadic Shoshone, who moved with the seasons to follow game and plant resources, the Hidatsa stayed in their villages for much of the year, cultivating crops of corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in the fertile floodplains near their settlements. Life in a Hidatsa village followed different rhythms than life in a mobile Shoshone camp. The earth lodges, constructed with wooden frames covered by layers of willow branches and packed earth, could house multiple families and provided sturdy shelter against the harsh Dakota winters. The villages themselves were bustling centers of activity, with hundreds of people living in close proximity, working in nearby fields during the growing season, and engaging in various crafts and daily tasks throughout the year. For Sacajawea, arriving in this new place must have been overwhelming. She had to learn a new language, adapt to new customs, and find her place in a society that viewed her as an outsider, a former enemy. The process of acculturation was likely both challenging and gradual. Some captives were treated relatively well and eventually integrated into Hidatsa society through adoption or marriage. Others faced harsher treatment, occupying a lower status in the social hierarchy. During her years among the Hidatsa, Sacajawea learned their language and customs. She would have worked alongside Hidatsa women in the agricultural fields, learning to plant, tend, and harvest crops, skills very different from the gathering and hunting practices of her Shoshone upbringing. She would have participated in the processing and preservation of food, the creation of pottery, and the tanning of hides. She adapted because survival required adaptation. The Hidatsa villages were also important trading centers. Their location along the Missouri River and their agricultural productivity made them attractive partners for various other tribes. French-Canadian fur traders had established relationships with the Hidatsa and neighboring Mandan villages, creating a complex, multicultural environment where goods, ideas, and people from diverse backgrounds intersected. It was in this context that Sacagawea's life would take another significant turn. Living in or near the Hidatsa villages were several French-Canadian fur traders and trappers, men who had ventured into the interior of the continent, seeking furs and other trade goods. These traders often formed relationships with indigenous women, unions that could provide various advantages: companionship, cultural knowledge, language interpretation skills, and connections to native trading networks. One such trader was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian who had lived among the Hidatsa for several years. Charbonneau was not a particularly notable figure in the fur trade. He was no great explorer or respected leader. He was, by most accounts, a fairly ordinary trader and trapper, someone making a living on the frontier through modest fur trading and serving occasionally as an interpreter. He spoke French and Hidatsa, and his presence in the villages had given him connections to both the indigenous communities and the occasional European-American visitors who passed through the region. When Sacajawea was about 13 or 14 years old, around 1801 or 1802, she became one of Charbonneau's wives. The circumstances of this union are not entirely clear from historical records. Some sources suggest he won her and Otter Woman in a gambling match with the Hidatsa who had captured them. Others suggest he purchased them. What is clear is that Sacajawea became the wife of this French-Canadian trader while still very young, in an arrangement that may or may not have involved her consent or preference. Charbonneau already had at least one other wife, and polygamy was not uncommon in the region, being practiced by some indigenous groups and accepted by some of the traders who had integrated into native societies. Sacagawea's life as Charbonneau's wife would have involved the typical duties of women in the fur-trading frontier culture: preparing meals, working hides, making and repairing clothing, managing domestic spaces, and likely assisting with aspects of the trading business. It was not the life she would have chosen, not the future she had imagined as a child among the Shoshone. But it was the reality she faced, and like so many people throughout history who have found themselves in circumstances beyond their control, she adapted and survived. Little did she know that her unique combination of experiences, her Shoshone origins, her knowledge of the Rocky Mountain region, her years among the Hidatsa, and her marriage to a French-Canadian trader would soon make her an invaluable member of one of history's most famous expeditions. The Corps of Discovery arrives. In the fall of 1804, a group of American explorers arrived at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages along the Missouri River. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the Corps of Discovery had been traveling up the Missouri River since May of that year, having set out from near St. Louis with the ambitious goal of finding a water route to the Pacific Ocean and exploring the recently acquired Louisiana Purchase territory. The Corps of Discovery was a military expedition authorized by President Thomas Jefferson, who had long dreamed of exploring the western reaches of the continent. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had doubled the size of the United States, adding vast territories that were largely unknown to Americans. Jefferson saw the expedition as an opportunity to gather scientific information, establish American presence in the region, make contact with indigenous peoples, assess the potential for fur trading, and search for the elusive Northwest Passage, a hypothetical water route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Lewis and Clark's expedition included about 33 permanent members, along with several additional men who would travel only part of the way. These men were mostly soldiers from the U.S. Army, along with a few civilians hired for specific skills like hunting or river navigation. They traveled in a large keelboat and two smaller boats called pirogues, hauling supplies, gifts for indigenous peoples they would meet, scientific instruments, and various other equipment. By the time they reached the Mandan Hidatsa villages in late October 1804, the expedition had already traveled over 1,600 miles from their starting point. The approach of winter meant they needed to establish a winter camp where they could wait out the harsh Dakota winter before continuing their journey westward in the spring. They chose a location across the river from the Mandan villages and set about constructing Fort Mandan, a triangular fortification with log huts where the men would live during the long, cold months ahead. During that winter of 1804-1805, Lewis and Clark gathered as much information as they could about the territory that lay ahead of them. They questioned traders, trappers, and indigenous peoples about the geography, the tribes they would encounter, the nature of the Rocky Mountains they would have to cross, and any other details that might help them plan the next phase of their journey. It was during this period that they became aware of a unique opportunity. They learned that there was a Shoshone woman living in the area as the wife of one of the French-Canadian traders. This was significant because Lewis and Clark knew that their route would take them through Shoshone territory in the Rocky Mountains. They had heard that horses would be essential for crossing the mountains, and they would need to obtain these horses through trade with the Shoshone. Having someone who could speak the Shoshone language and potentially help negotiate with her people could prove invaluable. Toussaint Charbonneau approached the expedition leaders and offered his services as an interpreter. He spoke Hidatsa and French, which could be useful, but more importantly, he had a Shoshone wife who could serve as an interpreter when they reached her people's territory. Lewis and Clark agreed to hire Charbonneau, which meant that Sacajawea would also be joining the expedition. At this point in her life, Sacajawea was approximately 16 years old and pregnant with her first child. The prospect of joining the expedition must have stirred complex emotions. On one hand, the journey would take her away from the relative stability and familiarity of the Hidatsa villages where she had lived for several years. It would mean traveling into unknown territory, facing unknown dangers, and dealing with the hardships of a long, difficult journey. On the other hand, the expedition's route would take her back toward her homeland, back toward the mountains where the Shoshone lived. After years of separation, she would have the opportunity to possibly reunite with her people, to see if any of her family members had survived the raid that had torn her from them. This hope, however faint, must have been compelling. Additionally, as Charbonneau's wife, she likely had little choice in the matter. If he had decided to join the expedition, she would be expected to accompany him. The birth of Jean-Baptiste Winter along the Missouri River in North Dakota is harsh and unforgiving. Temperatures plunge well below zero, snow covers the ground for months, and fierce winds sweep across the plains. Inside the wooden walls of Fort Mandan, the Corps of Discovery men went about their daily routines, hunting when possible, standing guard, maintaining their equipment, and waiting for spring to arrive so they could continue their journey. On February 11, 1805, During one of the coldest periods of that winter, Sacajawea went into labor. This was her first child, and the birthing process proved difficult and prolonged. For many hours, she labored in one of the fort's rooms while the male members of the expedition continued their activities elsewhere. Childbirth on the frontier was always a dangerous event, far from any medical facilities or trained doctors, relying entirely on the experience and knowledge of those present and the strength of the mother. Captain Lewis, who had some medical knowledge and had brought along medical supplies for the expedition, was present and concerned about the length and difficulty of Sacajawea's labor. René Jussomme, a French-Canadian trader living in the area, suggested a remedy that was used by indigenous women to speed labor: a small portion of a rattlesnake's rattle broken into small pieces and mixed with water. Lewis was skeptical but willing to try anything that might help. He retrieved some rattlesnake rattle from their supplies, prepared it according to Jussomme's instructions, and gave it to Sacajawea. Whether due to the rattlesnake remedy, the natural progression of labor, or simply coincidence, Sacajawea delivered her baby shortly afterward. The child was a healthy boy, and she named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, giving him his father's surname but choosing a French first name. Captain Clark, who would develop a particular fondness for the child, began calling him Pomp or Pompey, a nickname that would stick throughout the expedition. The birth of Jean-Baptiste added a new dimension to Sacajawea's participation in the expedition. She would not simply be an interpreter and Charbonneau's wife. She would be undertaking one of history's greatest journeys while caring for an infant. This was no small matter. Infants require constant care, frequent feeding, protection from the elements, and patience during difficult times. The journey ahead would involve traveling through wilderness, crossing mountains, navigating dangerous rivers, dealing with extreme weather, and facing various other hardships, all while carrying and caring for a baby. Yet this was not entirely unusual for indigenous women of the time, who often continued their regular activities and travels while caring for young children. Cradleboards allowed babies to be carried securely on their mothers' backs, keeping them safe while leaving the mother's hands relatively free for work or travel. Sacagawea's experience and cultural background had prepared her for the practical aspects of traveling with an infant, even if the scale and duration of this particular journey were unprecedented. The presence of a woman and baby in the expedition party would also serve an important diplomatic function, though this was not necessarily planned or fully understood at the outset. In the indigenous cultures they would encounter along the way, war parties traveled without women and children. The presence of a woman with a baby would signal to any indigenous peoples they met that this was not a war party, but a peaceful group traveling through the land. This nonverbal communication would prove valuable on multiple occasions throughout the journey. Setting out. The journey begins. As winter gradually loosened its grip and signs of spring began to appear, the Corps of Discovery prepared to resume their journey. They had spent the cold months repairing equipment, building new boats, making clothing, and gathering all the information they could about what lay ahead. Now, as the ice on the Missouri River began to break up and the weather turned milder, it was time to continue westward into the unknown. On April 7, 1805, the expedition departed from Fort Mandan. This marked a significant transition point in their journey. The keelboat that had brought them up the river from St. Louis was being sent back downriver with a small crew, carrying specimens, artifacts, reports, and messages for President Jefferson. From this point forward, the expedition would travel in 6 smaller canoes and the 2 pirogues, a fleet better suited to the narrower, shallower waters they expected to encounter as they moved farther west. The permanent party now consisted of 33 people, the 2 captains, 3 sergeants, 23 privates, Charbonneau, Sacajawea, and baby Jean-Baptiste, Clark's enslaved man York, and a hunter named George Drouillard. They were venturing into territory that no European Americans had ever documented, carrying with them the hopes of a nation curious about its new western lands and a president eager for knowledge about the continent. For Sacajawea, this departure represented a step into her future and potentially back toward her past. Jean-Baptiste was just 2 months old, still entirely dependent on his mother for everything. The daily routine of travel quickly became established. Each morning the party would rise early, eat a quick breakfast, pack up camp, and load the boats. They would travel for as many hours as daylight and conditions permitted, covering anywhere from 10 to 20 miles on a good day. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on wind, current, and obstacles. The Missouri River at this point was still a broad, powerful waterway, but it was becoming shallower and narrower as they traveled upstream toward its source. The men spent their days paddling, poling, and sometimes pulling the boats against the current. It was hard, exhausting work. Sacajawea, with Jean-Baptiste secured in his cradleboard, would ride in one of the boats, nursing the baby when needed, helping with small tasks, and observing the landscape they passed through. As they progressed westward through what is now North Dakota and into Montana, they saw vast herds of buffalo covering the plains, along with elk, antelope, and many other animals. The abundance of game meant the expedition had plenty of fresh meat, supplemented by plants and roots that Sacajawea helped identify and collect. Her knowledge of edible plants proved valuable, as she could recognize species that grew in this region and point out which were good to eat, which had medicinal properties, and which should be avoided. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled. The plains gave way to more broken terrain, with hills, rock formations, and increasingly visible signs that they were approaching the mountains. The river itself began to change character, becoming swifter and more difficult to navigate in places. They passed through areas of stunning natural beauty, including regions with unusual rock formations and colorful geological features that captured the attention of Lewis, who meticulously recorded observations about everything they encountered. Challenges along the Missouri. As spring turned to early summer, the expedition continued pushing westward, and the challenges they faced multiplied. The Missouri River's current grew stronger as they ascended toward its headwaters. Sandbars, fallen trees, and shallow areas frequently impeded their progress, requiring the men to get into the cold water and physically haul the boats over or around obstacles. The work was grueling, and injuries and illnesses were common. In mid-May, they encountered a significant obstacle when a sudden storm struck while they were traveling. One of the pirogues, carrying many of the expedition's most valuable items including instruments, journals, medicine, and trade goods, was nearly capsized by a strong gust of wind. Charbonneau, who was steering the boat at the time, panicked and failed to respond appropriately to the crisis. The boat began taking on water and tilting dangerously. While the men shouted instructions and Cruzat, a boatman, threatened to shoot Charbonneau if he didn't regain control, Sacajawea calmly reached into the water and retrieved articles that were floating away from the boat. Her quick thinking and presence of mind saved many important items that would have been irreplaceable. Lewis, who witnessed the incident from shore, later wrote in his journal praising Sacagawea's composure and resourcefulness during the crisis. This was just one of several occasions throughout the journey where her contributions would prove significant, though her role is sometimes overshadowed in popular accounts that focus more heavily on the male leaders of the expedition. Throughout these weeks and months of travel, life settled into patterns even amid the constant movement and changing landscapes. Each evening when they made camp, There were established routines. The boats had to be unloaded and secured. Tents were set up or sleeping areas prepared. Fires were built for cooking and warmth. Hunters would go out to find game for dinner. Guards were posted to watch for potential threats from animals or hostile indigenous peoples. Lewis would work on his journal entries, recording the day's observations about distance traveled, landmarks encountered, plants and animals seen, and various other details. Sacajawea would care for Jean-Baptiste, nursing him, keeping him clean and comfortable, and protecting him from mosquitoes and other irritants that plagued the expedition. She would help prepare meals, often digging for roots that supplemented the meat the hunters provided. She made or repaired moccasins, as footwear wore out quickly on the rough terrain. She assisted in various other camp tasks while managing the demands of caring for an infant in wilderness conditions. The presence of a baby in the camp added both challenges and moments of lightness to the journey. Jean-Baptiste was generally a healthy, good-natured child, but he had his fussy moments, as all babies do. The men, many of whom were young and had little experience with infants, nonetheless seemed to enjoy having the child among them. Captain Clark developed a particularly strong attachment to Jean-Baptiste, often playing with him and expressing affection for the boy in his journal entries. As they traveled deeper into the continent, the expedition began to see more evidence of grizzly bears, which were much larger and more dangerous than the black bears found in eastern forests. Several encounters with grizzlies resulted in close calls and reinforced the need for constant vigilance. The bears were not the only wildlife hazard. Rattlesnakes were common in some areas, and buffalo herds, while providing meat, could also be dangerous if the animals were startled or provoked. By early June 1805, the expedition reached a significant geographical decision point. The Missouri River forked, creating two major branches that appeared roughly equal in size. Which branch was the true Missouri River that would lead them to its headwaters near the Continental Divide? Choosing wrong could cost them weeks of time and supplies they could not afford to waste. The wrong choice could potentially doom the expedition. Lewis and Clark examined both branches carefully. The northern fork had muddy water like the Missouri they had been following. The southern fork had clearer water. After careful consideration and scouting missions up both branches, the captains became convinced that the southern fork was the correct choice, even though most of the men believed the northern fork looked more like the Missouri they had been traveling. The captain's judgment proved correct. The southern fork was indeed the Missouri River, and the northern branch, which they named Maria's River, now Mariah's River, was a separate tributary. The Great Falls and the mountains beyond. Following the southern branch of the Missouri, the expedition soon began to hear a sound that grew louder as they traveled, the rumble of falling water. They had been told by the Hidatsa about great waterfalls on the Missouri, and now they were approaching this landmark that would confirm they were still on the correct route toward the mountains. In mid-June, they reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, a series of 5 major waterfalls and several smaller cascades stretching over about 10 miles of river. The falls were spectacular, with water plunging over rocks in powerful displays that impressed the entire party. But the falls also represented a major obstacle. The boats could not possibly navigate such waterfalls, which meant the expedition would have to portage around them, carrying all their boats, equipment, and supplies overland to the river above the falls. This portage, which they initially thought might take a few days, ended up consuming nearly a month. The terrain was rough, covered with prickly pear cacti that pierced through the men's worn moccasins, causing painful injuries. The route was about 18 miles long, and everything had to be carried or pulled on crude wheeled carts the men constructed. The boats themselves were heavy and unwieldy, The weather alternated between intense heat and sudden violent storms with hail that bruised the men and drove them to seek shelter. For Sacajawea, the portage period was particularly challenging. She had fallen ill shortly before they reached the falls, suffering from what Lewis described as a serious abdominal disorder with fever and severe pain. Lewis treated her with various remedies from his medicine chest, including bleeding her, which was a common medical practice at the time, though not particularly effective. Her condition was serious enough that Lewis and Clark were genuinely worried she might die. During this illness, she still had to care for Jean-Baptiste, though she was weakened and in pain. The other members of the expedition helped where they could, but an infant needed his mother, especially for nursing. Gradually, with treatment and rest, Sacajawea's condition improved. By the time the portage was complete and they were ready to resume water travel above the falls, she had recovered enough to continue, though the illness had taken its toll on her strength. As they continued westward beyond the Great Falls, the landscape became increasingly dominated by mountains. The Rocky Mountains rose before them, a formidable barrier of stone and snow that they would have to cross to reach the Columbia River drainage on the other side. The river they followed became smaller, shallower, and swifter as they ascended toward its source. It was now late July 1805, and the expedition was entering the time of year when they urgently needed to complete the most challenging part of their journey. They had to cross the mountains before winter arrived, which meant they needed horses. And to get horses, they needed to find the Shoshone, return to her people. For Sacajawea, the landscape they were entering held deep significance. These were the mountains of her childhood, the territory where she had lived before the Topithonidis raid that changed her life. Every day's travel brought her closer to the possibility of reuniting with her people, though she could not know whether her family had survived, where her band might be located, or how she would be received after years of absence. The captains were anxious to make contact with the Shoshone. They knew that without horses and guides, crossing the mountains would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, especially with winter approaching. But finding the Shoshone in the vast mountainous wilderness was proving challenging. The river they followed had divided into 3 major branches, and they had chosen what they believed was the westernmost branch, following it toward its source. Lewis went ahead with a small party, scouting for the Shoshone, while Clark and the main party continued bringing the boats upstream. The stream was becoming so small and shallow that the boats frequently grounded, requiring constant effort to keep them moving. The men waded in the cold water, sometimes up to their waists, pushing and pulling the boats over rocks and through narrow passages. Then, on August 8, 1805, Sacajawea recognized a significant landmark. She identified it as a place she remembered from her childhood, a rock formation that the Shoshone called the Beaver's Head because of its shape. She told the captains that this was a known landmark in Shoshone territory, and that her people would often be found at the place where 3 rivers came together, which was not far ahead. This information was encouraging, suggesting they were indeed in the right area to find the Shoshone. Meanwhile, Lewis's advance party encountered several Shoshone who initially fled at the sight of strangers. After persistent effort, Lewis finally managed to establish peaceful contact with a group of Shoshone. Through gestures and the few Shoshone words Lewis had learned from Sacajawea, he communicated peaceful intentions. The Shoshone were cautious, but agreed to meet with the main party of the expedition. When the main party arrived at the meeting place, and Sacajawea saw the Shoshone, her emotions must have been overwhelming. These were her people, speaking the language she had not heard since childhood, dressed in the traditional styles she remembered, living the way she had once lived. When she met with the Shoshone chief to serve as interpreter, she made an astonishing discovery. The chief was her brother, Sacajawea. The reunion was emotional and surprising. Sacajawea had not expected to find her brother, and certainly not to find him as the leader of the band. She learned that most of her family had been killed in various raids over the years, including both of her parents. Her brother had risen to leadership in the band, and now here was his sister, whom he had thought lost forever, returning as part of a group of American explorers traveling through Shoshone territory. The joyful reunion was mixed with complex realities. Sacajawea was not simply returning home. She was married to Charbonneau, had a child, and was committed to continuing the expedition. She could not simply stay with her people, even though part of her might have wished to do so. Her duty was to serve as interpreter, to help the expedition acquire horses and find their way across the mountains, and then to continue with them toward the Pacific Ocean. Through Sacagawea's interpretation, negotiations proceeded between the expedition leaders and the Shoshone. The discussions were complicated, involving not only the immediate need for horses, but also broader questions about trade, alliances, and the political landscape of the region. The Shoshone were in a difficult position themselves. They had been driven from the plains by better armed enemies and struggled to obtain guns and other trade goods. They were cautious about their limited horse herd, which was essential to their way of life. Eventually, agreements were reached. The expedition purchased horses and hired a Shoshone guide named Old Toby, who knew the mountain passes. The terms were not entirely favorable to the expedition. They paid high prices for horses that were not always in the best condition, but they got what they needed to continue their journey. During the time spent with the Shoshone, Sacajawea also learned more about what had happened to others she had known. She discovered that one of the girls captured with her in the original raid had escaped and made it back to the Shoshone. She learned of the fates of various relatives and friends. She was able to speak her native language again, to eat traditional Shoshone foods, and to experience, however briefly, a connection to the life she had known as a child. But the expedition could not linger long. August was already well advanced, and crossing the mountains before winter was critical. With horses, a guide, and renewed supplies, the Corps of Discovery prepared to tackle the most challenging phase of their journey, crossing the Bitterroot Mountains. If the journey up the Missouri had been difficult, the crossing of the Bitterroot Mountains proved to be a trial that tested the expedition's endurance, determination, and survival skills to their limits. These mountains, part of the northern Rocky Mountain Range straddling what is now the Idaho-Montana border, presented obstacles that even Old Toby, experienced as he was, found challenging to navigate. The route took them along steep, narrow trails that sometimes followed ridgelines and other times plunged into deep valleys. The terrain was so rough that horses stumbled and fell, sometimes injuring themselves or losing their loads. One horse carrying essential supplies fell down a mountainside and was killed. Food became scarce as game was difficult to find in the high mountain environment. The weather turned cold, with early September bringing snow to the high elevations. For Sacajawea, traveling through these mountains while caring for Jean-Baptiste, who was now about 7 months old, required tremendous strength and determination. The cold affected everyone, but a baby was particularly vulnerable to temperature extremes. She had to ensure he stayed warm and dry, continued to nurse him despite the physical demands on her own body from the difficult travel and limited food, and keep his spirits up when the entire party was suffering from exhaustion and hunger. The expedition's food supplies dwindled alarmingly. They were forced to kill some of their horses for meat, a decision made only out of desperate necessity. They named one creek Killed Colt Creek to mark the location where they first resorted to eating horse meat. The men were weakened by hunger and the constant physical exertion of traversing the mountain terrain. Some became ill. Morale suffered as the mountain crossing seemed to stretch on endlessly with no end in sight. Finally, in late September, they began descending the western slopes of the mountains and saw signs that they were approaching more hospitable terrain. They encountered the Nez Perce people, who lived in the river valleys on the western side of the mountains. The Nez Perce received them hospitably, providing food and assistance. For the starving expedition members, the generosity of the Nez Perce was literally life-saving, though the sudden introduction of new foods after their period of near starvation caused digestive problems for many of the men. The expedition had survived the mountain crossing, but it had been a harrowing experience that came close to defeating them. Without old Toby's guidance, without the horses they had obtained from the Shoshone, and without good fortune with the weather and the hospitality of the Nez Perce, the outcome might have been very different. The Columbia River and journey to the ocean. After resting with the Nez Perce and regaining some strength, the expedition prepared to continue their journey westward. They were now in the drainage of the Columbia River system, which would carry them to the Pacific Ocean. The Nez Perce showed them trees suitable for making canoes, and the expedition set to work hollowing out large ponderosa pine logs to create vessels that would carry them down the rivers. By early October 1805, they launched their new canoes and began descending the Clearwater River, which would take them to the Snake River, which in turn would lead them to the Columbia. The river travel was a welcome change from the mountain crossing, though it had its own challenges. The rivers featured dangerous rapids that required careful navigation, and there were several close calls with boats nearly capsizing or being smashed on rocks. The character of the landscape changed dramatically as they descended. The lush forests of the mountains gave way to the drier terrain of the Columbia River Plateau. They passed through areas dominated by sagebrush and rugged basalt cliffs. They encountered various indigenous peoples who lived along the rivers, peoples who relied heavily on salmon fishing, and who had developed sophisticated methods for catching, processing, and preserving this important food source. As they approached the Columbia River, the number and size of indigenous settlements increased. The Columbia was a major trading thoroughfare, and the peoples who lived along it were part of extensive trade networks that stretched from the interior regions to the Pacific coast. These peoples had already had some contact with European and American traders who arrived by sea, and some had acquired trade goods like metal tools, glass beads, and cloth. For Sacajawea, this portion of the journey meant entering yet another cultural landscape, different from either her Shoshone homeland or the Hidatsa villages where she had lived. The languages spoken here were unrelated to Shoshone, and while her presence still served the valuable function of signaling peaceful intentions, her role as an interpreter was less central than it had been during the negotiations with the Shoshone. November brought them closer to their goal. The Columbia River widened and slowed as it approached the ocean. They began to notice tidal influences on the water levels. The weather turned rainy, a persistent drizzle that characterized the Pacific Northwest climate and would remain a constant feature of their winter stay on the coast. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote an optimistic entry in his journal, "Ocean in view, oh, the joy." In reality, what they were seeing was the broad estuary of the Columbia River, not quite the open ocean yet, but close enough that they could feel the accomplishment of having traveled across the continent. Within days, they reached points where they could see and hear the Pacific Ocean's waves, confirming that they had achieved one of the primary objectives of their expedition. The arrival at the Pacific was a momentous occasion, an achievement of continental crossing that had taken 18 months and covered over 4,000 miles. For Sacajawea, it meant having traveled farther than perhaps any Shoshone woman before her, having seen landscapes and peoples beyond anything she could have imagined as a child. She had served the expedition well, contributing in ways both large and small to its success, and she had done all of this while caring for an infant, a feat that deserves recognition as remarkable in its own right. Winter at Fort Clatsop. Having reached the Pacific, the expedition faced an important decision: where to spend the winter. It was already November, and returning eastward before spring was not realistic given the difficulty of crossing the mountains in winter. They needed to establish a winter camp where they could wait out the cold months, rest, repair equipment, and prepare for the return journey. Various locations near the mouth of the Columbia were considered. Captain Clark explored several potential sites. Interestingly, when the decision was put to a vote among the expedition members, Sacajawea was allowed to participate. A remarkable gesture for the time, as neither women nor enslaved people, York also voted, typically had such input in formal decisions. Sacajawea expressed a preference for a location where she might have the opportunity to see a beached whale, showing that her hopes and interests extended beyond merely following orders. The expedition decided to establish their winter camp on the south side of the Columbia River, near present-day Astoria, Oregon. They built a fort they named Fort Clatsop, after the local Clatsop tribe, with whom they would have frequent interaction throughout the winter. The fort consisted of 2 rows of small rooms facing each other across a parade ground, enclosed by a stockade wall for security. The winter of 1805-1806 at Fort Clatsop was challenging in different ways than the mountain crossing had been. While they were not in immediate danger of starvation or freezing, the constant rain and damp conditions were wearing on everyone's spirits. Nearly every day brought rain, and keeping things dry was a constant struggle. Clothing and leather goods mildewed. The men suffered from various illnesses, including colds, influenza, and venereal diseases, contracted from some of the coastal peoples with whom they interacted. Sacajawea and Jean-Baptiste lived in one of the small rooms at Fort Clatsop throughout that winter. By now, Jean-Baptiste was nearly a year old, beginning to sit up and becoming more interactive and aware of his surroundings. Sacajawea continued her work preparing food, making and repairing clothing, and contributing to the daily activities of the expedition community. One notable event during the winter occurred when word reached the fort that a large whale had washed ashore some miles to the south. Captain Clark organized a small party to travel to the location, both to see the whale and to try to obtain blubber and oil that could supplement their food supplies. Sacajawea insisted on being included in this excursion. She reminded them, come all this way across the continent, and she deserved the opportunity to see the ocean and this great creature. Her request was granted, and she made the journey with Clark's party to see the whale. By the time they arrived, the local Tillamook people had already stripped most of the useful parts from the carcass. But Clark was able to purchase some oil and blubber, and Sacajawea saw both the ocean and the remains of the whale. Throughout the winter, the expedition members worked on various tasks to prepare for the return journey. They made new moccasins to replace the many pairs worn out during the journey west. They repaired equipment and packed their remaining trade goods. Lewis worked on his journal entries and scientific notes. Clark worked on maps, synthesizing all the geographical information they had gathered. Hunting parties went out regularly to bring in meat, with elk being particularly important to their food supply. The coastal indigenous peoples visited the fort regularly, bringing fish and other items to trade. Relations were generally peaceful, but sometimes tense. The peoples of this region had more experience with European and American traders than many of the peoples the expedition had encountered earlier in their journey. And this familiarity meant they were shrewd traders who drove hard bargains. The expedition's trade goods were running low, making these exchanges sometimes difficult. As winter gradually gave way to early spring, preparations for departure became more focused. The expedition was eager to leave as soon as weather and river conditions permitted. They hoped to return more quickly than the outbound journey had taken, as they would be traveling mostly downstream on the rivers and could draw on the geographical knowledge they had gained on the way west. The return journey. On March 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery departed from Fort Clatsop and began the long journey home. The return trip would prove to be faster than the outbound journey, but would also have its own challenges and adventures. They essentially retraced their route eastward, ascending the Columbia River and its tributaries back toward the mountains they would have to cross. The Columbia River portion of the return journey went relatively smoothly, though rapids remained dangerous and several canoes were damaged. They again encountered various indigenous peoples along the river, with interactions ranging from friendly to tense. At the Dalles, a major trading location on the Columbia where the river narrowed and dropped through a series of rapids and falls, they had some of their most difficult encounters with local peoples, though violence was avoided. By late April, they had made their way back to the Nez Perce territory at the base of the Bitterroot Mountains. However, they faced an unexpected problem. The mountain passes were still blocked by heavy snow. It was simply too early in the season to attempt the crossing. The expedition would have to wait for the snow to melt enough to make passage possible. This forced delay lasted over a month, during which the expedition members stayed with the Nez Perce. The relationship between the expedition and the Nez Perce remained positive, and this extended stay allowed for increased cultural exchange. The expedition shared their own foods and customs while learning more about Nez Perce culture. However, the delay was frustrating for the captains, who were anxious to continue homeward. During this waiting period, Sacajawea continued caring for Jean-Baptiste, who was now over a year old and becoming more mobile and active. The spring weather was more pleasant than the wet winter on the coast, and the time with the Nez Perce, while longer than planned, was not particularly stressful. Finally, in mid-June, the expedition set out to cross the mountains, guided by Nez Perce guides who knew the route and snow conditions. Even with experienced guides, the crossing remained challenging. Deep snow still covered much of the high country, and finding the trail required expertise the expedition alone did not possess. The crossing was successful, but it confirmed that attempting it earlier without the Nez Perce guides would have been disastrous. Once across the mountains, the expedition made a significant decision. They would divide into smaller parties to accomplish multiple objectives on the return journey, then reunite downstream. Lewis would lead one group to explore the Marias River to the north. Clark would lead another group to explore the Yellowstone River. A third group would bring the canoes down the Missouri. This decision to split up was risky, but allowed them to gather more geographical information. Sacajawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste traveled with Clark's party. The route took them back to the Three Forks area where the Missouri's major tributaries came together, the place where Sacajawea had been captured by the Hidatsa years earlier. Clark was searching for a land route to the Yellowstone River, and Sacagawea's knowledge of the region proved valuable. She recommended a pass that Clark and his party used successfully to reach the Yellowstone. Clark wrote appreciatively in his journals about Sacagawea's guidance during this portion of the journey. Her familiarity with the landscape, even after years of absence, helped the party navigate efficiently through terrain that would otherwise have required more time-consuming exploration. This was one of the more direct and clearly documented examples of her practical contribution to the expedition's geographic success. The Clark party descended the Yellowstone River in boats they constructed, reaching the Missouri and then proceeding downstream. The Lewis party had a more eventful time, including a violent encounter with some Blackfeet Indians in which 2 natives were killed, the only violent deaths of indigenous people during the expedition. Lewis's party then hastened down the Missouri, eventually reuniting with Clark's group in mid-August. Return to civilization. The reunited expedition continued rapidly down the Missouri. They were now in familiar territory, having passed through this region both directions. They knew where they were going, and they were eager to get home. The current assisted their downriver progress, allowing them to cover in days distances that had taken weeks to traverse upstream. In mid-August, they reached the Mandan villages where they had spent the previous winter and where they had hired Charbonneau and Sacajawea. This marked the endpoint of Charbonneau and Sacajawea's service to the expedition. They had fulfilled their obligations, and this is where they would stay. For Sacajawea, it meant the end of the great journey that had taken her across the continent and back. She had traveled thousands of miles, crossed mountains and descended rivers, seen the Pacific Ocean, and met numerous different peoples. Jean-Baptiste, now a year and a half old, had spent virtually his entire life traveling. The parting between the expedition members and Sacagawea's family appears to have been amicable. Clark had grown particularly attached to Jean-Baptiste and made an offer to Charbonneau and Sacajawea. If they would allow him to take the boy and raise him in St. Louis, Clark would see to his education and upbringing. It was a significant offer, reflecting both the opportunities Clark could provide and his genuine affection for the child. However, Sacajawea and Charbonneau were not ready to part with their son at this time. He was still too young, still nursing, still completely dependent on his mother. Perhaps in the future such an arrangement might be possible, but not yet. Clark paid Charbonneau $530 for his services on the expedition and gave him a horse. Records don't indicate any payment directly to Sacajawea, which was typical for the time given that women rarely received wages independently. Clark wrote a recommendation for Charbonneau, noting his usefulness as an interpreter, though the recommendation was somewhat lukewarm compared to recommendations Clark wrote for other expedition members. The expedition continued downstream, now without Sacajawea and her family. They traveled through increasingly settled territory, encountering American traders and trappers heading upriver with whom they shared news and stories. On September 23, 1806, they reached St. Louis, completing their journey of over 8,000 miles in 2 years and 4 months of travel. The Lewis and Clark expedition was hailed as a great success. They had not found the hoped-for water route to the Pacific. No such Northwest Passage existed, but they had made invaluable contributions to geographical knowledge, had established American presence in the West, had made contact with numerous indigenous peoples, had brought back extensive scientific observations, and had demonstrated that overland travel to the Pacific was possible. The journals and maps they produced became foundational documents for understanding the Western Territories. Later, years after parting from the expedition, Sacagawea's life becomes less clearly documented. Historical records from this period are sparse and sometimes contradictory, leading to ongoing debates among historians about exactly what happened to her in the years following 1806. What seems relatively certain is that she and Charbonneau remained in the Mandan Hidatsa region for a time. They may have lived there for a few years, with Charbonneau continuing to work as an interpreter and trader. Life would have returned to a more settled routine after the extraordinary journey of the expedition. Sacajawea would have resumed the normal activities of a woman in her community, raising her child, managing domestic affairs, working alongside other women in the gardens, and in processing food and materials. Historical records indicate that in 1809, Charbonneau and Sacajawea took William Clark up on his offer regarding Jean-Baptiste's education. They traveled to St. Louis, where Clark had become an important figure in the territorial government. True to his word, Clark took on the responsibility of Jean-Baptiste's upbringing and education. The boy would grow up in St. Louis, receiving an education that would prepare him for a remarkable life of his own, including eventually traveling to Europe, where he spent years at royal courts, before returning to America and working as a guide and mountain man in the West. With Jean-Baptiste in St. Louis being educated under Clark's guardianship, Sacajawea and Charbonneau returned to the upper Missouri region. During the following years, Charbonneau continued working in various capacities related to the fur trade and as an interpreter. Records show him at different times at different locations, sometimes at the Mandan villages, other times at Fort Manuel, a trading post established in present-day South Dakota. It is at this point that the historical record regarding Sacajawea becomes most problematic and contested. One set of historical documents suggests that Sacajawea died in December 1812 at Fort Manuel. These documents include a notation by clerk John Luttig, who kept a journal at the fort and recorded the death of Charbonneau's wife on December 20th, 1812, describing her as the best woman in the fort, and noting she was about 25 years old. If this entry refers to Sacajawea, she would have died of putrid fever, likely typhoid or another serious infection, at approximately age 24. Additionally, William Clark compiled a list around 1825 to 1828 of expedition members and what had become of them. On this list, next to Sacagawea's name, he wrote dead. This has been interpreted by many historians as confirmation that Sacajawea died young, around 1812. However, there is an alternative tradition, particularly strong among the Shoshone people and some historians, that Sacajawea did not die in 1812 but lived a much longer life. According to this tradition, she left Charbonneau and eventually returned to her Shoshone people, living on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. This tradition holds that she lived well into old age, dying in 1884 at nearly 100 years old. A woman named Porivo, also known as Chief Woman or Lost Woman, who lived on the Wind River Reservation and died in 1884, has been identified in this tradition as Sacajawea. This alternative narrative is supported by oral histories among the Shoshone, by accounts from people who knew Porivo and believed her to be the Sacajawea of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and by certain documents and testimonies collected in the early 20th century. Those who support this version of Sacagawea's later life point to the respect with which Porivo was treated, her knowledge of events and places, consistent with the expedition, and Shoshone oral traditions maintaining she was the same person. The debate between these two versions of Sacagawea's fate has persisted for over a century. Mainstream historians generally accept the 1812 death date, citing the contemporary documents from that time period. However, the alternative tradition remains important, particularly within Shoshone communities and among some researchers who believe the documentation for the 1812 death is ambiguous and possibly refers to one of Charbonneau's other wives rather than Sacajawea. For our purposes this evening, what we can say with certainty is that Sacagawea's later life, whatever its details, was lived away from the historical spotlight that had briefly illuminated her during the expedition. If she died in 1812, she passed away at a young age, her remarkable journey to the Pacific representing the extraordinary episode in an otherwise ordinary life on the frontier. If she lived much longer, and returned to her Shoshone people, she experienced many more years, raising children, participating in her community, and carrying within her the memories of that great journey across the continent. Legacy and memory. Regardless of when Sacajawea died, her historical significance has grown tremendously over the 2 centuries since the Lewis and Clark expedition. During her lifetime and for many decades afterward, she was a relatively minor figure in accounts of the expedition. The published journals focused primarily on the captains and the geographical and scientific discoveries. Sacajawea was mentioned, certainly, but often in passing and without extensive detail about her contributions. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that Sacajawea began to receive more significant attention. As women's suffrage movements gained strength, Sacajawea was embraced as a symbol of women's capabilities and contributions. Suffragists pointed to her as an example of a woman who had participated in and contributed to an important national endeavor, arguing that if a woman could help guide an expedition across the continent, women certainly deserved the right to vote and participate fully in civic life. The centennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1905-1906 brought renewed interest in the journey and its participants. Sacajawea was prominently featured in the celebrations and commemorations. Statues were erected, schools were named after her, and numerous articles and books told and retold her story, often embellishing it with romantic or dramatic elements not supported by the historical record. Throughout the 20th century, Sacagawea's fame continued to grow. She appeared on a US dollar coin issued in 2000. She has been the subject of countless books, both fiction and nonfiction, for both adults and children. Movies, television programs, and other media have portrayed her story in various ways. She has become one of the most famous Native American women in American history, her name and image recognized by people who might know little else about the Lewis and Clark expedition. This posthumous fame has been a mixed blessing. On one hand, it has ensured that Sacajawea is remembered and that her contributions are acknowledged. She has become an important symbol, particularly for Native American communities, women's history advocates, and those interested in Western American history. On the other hand, the real Sacajawea, the actual person who lived and breathed, who suffered and persevered, who cared for her infant son while traveling thousands of miles through wilderness, has sometimes been obscured by the mythologized versions of her story. Various groups have projected their own meanings and messages onto her, sometimes in ways that may not reflect the reality of her life or experiences. Some portrayals have romanticized her role, depicting her as the true guide of the expedition, or attributing to her decisions and actions not supported by the historical record. Others have simplified her story, reducing her to a one-dimensional symbol rather than recognizing her as a complex human being who lived in difficult circumstances and made the best of situations over which she had limited control. Indigenous communities have sometimes had complicated relationships with how Sacagawea's story has been told. While she is celebrated as an important Native American historical figure, some have noted that the focus on her service to the American expedition can overshadow the broader context of Indigenous experiences during this period. Experiences that included displacement, disease, warfare, and the loss of traditional ways of life as American expansion proceeded westward. Additionally, the debates about her later life and death reflect not just scholarly disagreements about historical evidence, but also different cultural perspectives on memory, oral history, and what constitutes valid historical documentation. The Shoshone oral tradition, maintaining that Sacagawea lived to old age on the Wind River Reservation, represents a way of remembering and honoring her that has value and meaning independent of whether it aligns with documentary evidence accepted by academic historians. Reflections on a Remarkable Life. As we come toward the end of our time together this evening, let us reflect on what Sacagawea's story tells us about human resilience, adaptation, and the ways individual lives intersect with larger historical forces. Sacajawea did not choose most of the major turns her life took. She did not choose to be captured by the Hidatsa. She likely had little say in her marriage to Charbonneau. She probably did not decide independently to join the Lewis and Clark expedition. These were circumstances that happened to her, situations in which others made decisions that shaped her life's trajectory. Yet within these constraints, she made choices about how to respond. She learned new languages and adapted to new cultures. She cared for her infant son under extraordinarily difficult conditions. She contributed her knowledge and skills to the expedition's success. She survived and persevered through challenges that would have defeated many people. Her life reminds us that history is not just about the famous leaders whose names are recorded in textbooks, but also about the ordinary people whose experiences and contributions shape events in ways both large and small. Sacajawea was not the leader of the expedition. That role belonged to Lewis and Clark. But without her presence, her knowledge, her interpretation skills, and her symbolic importance as a woman with a baby signaling peaceful intentions, the expedition might well have failed or proceeded very differently. Her story also illuminates the complex cultural intersections that characterized the early American frontier. She was Shoshone by birth, lived among the Hidatsa, married a French Canadian, and traveled with an American military expedition. She interacted with dozens of different indigenous peoples during the journey, each with their own languages, customs, and perspectives. Her life embodied the multicultural nature of the American West, a reality that is sometimes forgotten in simplified narratives that portray Western expansion as simply a story of European Americans moving into empty territory. The fact that we know less about Sacajawea than we might wish, that significant questions about her life remain unresolved, is itself revealing. It reminds us that historical records have been kept primarily by those with power and literacy, and that the experiences of women, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups have often been incompletely documented or ignored entirely. Sacajawea appears in the historical record because she participated in an expedition that was extensively documented. But millions of indigenous women lived and died during this period, each with her own story, her own challenges, her own moments of courage and loss, and we will never know their names or experiences. At the same time, the tremendous interest in Sacajawea over the past century, the efforts to understand and document her life, and the ways she has been commemorated and remembered reflect a growing recognition that history must include diverse voices and perspectives. Her story, incomplete as our knowledge of it may be, helps us understand the human dimensions of a transformative period in American history. The broader context of her time. To fully appreciate Sacagawea's life, we must also understand the broader historical context of the period in which she lived. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of profound change for North America, and particularly for its indigenous peoples. For thousands of years before European contact, Native American peoples had lived across the continent in diverse societies ranging from small bands of hunter-gatherers to large agricultural civilizations. They had developed sophisticated understandings of their environments, complex social and political systems, rich spiritual traditions, and extensive trade networks. The continent was not empty or uncivilized. It was home to millions of people living in hundreds of distinct cultures. European colonization, which began in the 16th century and accelerated in the 17th and 18th centuries, brought catastrophic changes. Diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity, smallpox, measles, influenza, and others, killed vast numbers. Some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of the indigenous population died in the centuries following contact. Entire communities were wiped out, traditional knowledge was lost, and the social fabric of indigenous societies was torn apart. European expansion also brought warfare, displacement, and the loss of land. Different European powers, Spanish, French, English, competed for control of territory, and indigenous peoples were sometimes caught in the middle of these conflicts, sometimes allied with one power against another, and sometimes fighting to defend their own lands and ways of life. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which brought the vast central portion of North America under U.S. control, was negotiated between the United States and France without any input from the indigenous peoples who actually lived in those territories. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which followed shortly after, was explicitly intended to extend American influence into these newly acquired lands and to begin the process of incorporating them into the growing nation. For indigenous peoples like the Shoshone, these changes meant increasing pressure on their traditional territories and ways of life. They faced competing threats from other tribes, some of whom had been displaced from their own territories by European expansion, from European and American traders and settlers, and from the diseases that continued to ravage their populations. Traditional economies and social structures were disrupted as new goods, technologies, and economic systems were introduced. The period during which Sacajawea lived was thus a time of tremendous upheaval and transformation. She was born into a world where her people still lived largely according to traditional patterns, though already affected by indirect effects of European presence: horses, trade goods, diseases. She lived to see the beginning of more direct American expansion into the West. If she died in 1812, she did not witness the full extent of the changes that would come in the following decades. If she lived until 1884, she would have seen the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the near extinction of the buffalo, the wars between the U.S. government and various Plains tribes, and the establishment of the reservation system that confined indigenous peoples to restricted territories. In this context, Sacagawea's individual story takes on additional layers of meaning. She was one person navigating tremendous historical forces, trying to survive and care for her child amid circumstances far beyond her control. Her participation in the Lewis and Clark expedition, whatever her motivations or feelings about it, contributed to the expansion of American power into the West, an expansion that would ultimately prove devastating for her people and other indigenous peoples of the region. This is not to assign blame or responsibility to Sacajawea herself. She was not a policymaker or a military leader. She was a young woman trying to survive, and the expedition offered her opportunities to reunite with her people, to travel, to contribute her knowledge, as well as obligations. But recognizing the broader historical context helps us understand the complexities and contradictions in her story, and why discussions of her legacy can evoke different perspectives and emotions. Closing thoughts. As our evening together draws to a close, let us take a moment to appreciate what we have explored together about Sacagawea's life and times. We have journeyed with her from her birth into the Shoshone world, through the trauma of her capture, through her years among the Hidatsa, through the extraordinary adventure of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and into the uncertain knowledge we have of her later years. Her story resonates across the centuries because it touches on universal human experiences: loss and survival, adaptation and resilience, the bonds between parent and child, the experience of existing at the intersection of different cultures and powers. While the specific circumstances of her life were unique to her time and place, the essential human qualities she displayed, courage, determination, resourcefulness, care for her child, are recognizable and admirable in any era. She deserves to be remembered, not as a one-dimensional symbol or a romanticized figure, but as a real person who lived a difficult and remarkable life. She deserves to be remembered in all her complexity, with acknowledgement both of her contributions and of the constraints and challenges she faced. She deserves to be remembered as an individual who made choices within the options available to her, who cared for her son under extraordinary circumstances, and who left her mark on one of history's most famous expeditions. Her story also reminds us to think about all the other people, particularly women and indigenous peoples, whose stories have not been preserved or celebrated, but who also lived, loved, struggled, and contributed to the unfolding of history. Every person who has ever lived has had a story worthy of being told, experiences that mattered, moments of both joy and sorrow. Sacagawea's story is remarkable, but it is also representative of countless untold stories of survival and adaptation during times of change. As we think about Sacajawea tonight, we can honor her memory by seeking to understand historical events from multiple perspectives, including those of people who had little power to shape the recording of history. Recognizing the humanity and complexity of individuals who lived in very different times and circumstances from our own. Acknowledging both the contributions of individuals and the larger historical forces and systems that shaped their lives. Listening to and respecting different cultural traditions of remembering and honoring the past, including oral histories that may offer perspectives different from documentary records. Teaching future generations about people like Sacajawea in ways that are accurate, respectful, and mindful of complexity, rather than settling for simplified or romanticized versions of their stories. In remembering Sacajawea, we connect ourselves to a time of tremendous change and challenge, a time when different peoples and cultures encountered each other in both cooperation and conflict, a time when individual lives unfolded against a backdrop of historical forces that would reshape the continent. Her life spanned only about 24 years, or perhaps as many as 96 if the alternative tradition is correct. But in either case, she lived fully and remarkably, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and provoke thought more than 2 centuries later. As you prepare to rest this evening, perhaps you will dream of those distant times and distant places. The Rocky Mountains where a Shoshone girl learned to gather roots and ride horses. The Hidatsa villages along the Missouri where she adapted to a new life. The rivers and mountains she crossed while carrying her infant son. The Pacific Ocean she insisted on seeing, and whatever life she lived afterward, whether brief or long, whether recorded or lost to history. Her journey reminds us that history is made of individual human lives, each precious and unique, each worthy of respect and remembrance. In honoring Sacagawea's memory, we honor all those who have lived, struggled, and persevered through challenging times, and we remind ourselves of the resilience and dignity of the human spirit. Thank you for joining me tonight as we remembered and reflected on the life of Sacajawea. May you sleep peacefully, perhaps with images of her remarkable journey traveling through your dreams, connecting you to this fascinating period of history and this extraordinary woman whose name and story have endured across the generations. Good night, and may you rest well.